Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith.
Okay.
Hey everybody, this is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth, and I've got with me today a fascinating man. His name is Franco Romero. He's a top 10 best-selling author. He's a clairvoyant, he's a spiritual coach, and he's a speaker. His first book is titled The Closet Spiritualist, which was inspired by an NDE that he had, which left him clairvoyant. And these are abilities he was unwilling to recognize until he had an awakening in 2010, where he was reintroduced to a collective consciousness known as Caleb. He's currently writing his second book, The Modern Day Alchemist, which looks at our future from the perspective of God consciousness. A science of the mind is not only being revealed to humanity for the purpose of creating heaven on earth, and that's a quote from him, in the coming decade. He holds 2 master's degrees, and he's a co-founder of MyNurish, a formulator of powerful superfood and plant-based nutrition for the body, mind, and soul. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Franco. We were just talking before we got started. I said we need to go ahead and start recording this so we can get this out to the guests. So Franco, it's great to see you here today.
It's really great to be here. As I was saying, this is an interview I've been looking forward to for some time, Brian. So thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, well, just before we get started, I think we have a lot of mutual values and understandings of things. I'm fascinated by NDEs. A lot of my guests are, and I know you've told your story probably 1,000 times, but we've got to start with you telling your NDE story.
Yeah, okay, so my NDE, and you probably hear this from a lot of people, but my NDE was kind of unique, right? Like that's like not everybody's going to say that, right? So it's kind of unique in that it happened when I was 6 months old. And I was not aware that I had died back then until I was about 15 or 16. And the reason I became aware of that experience was because when I turned around 15, I started to have visions and lucid dreams of the event itself. And in that process, I eventually confronted my mother, and she kind of spilled the beans and told me that I had died. So I'll share with you the event and kind of fast forward to 15 years later.
Sure.
When I was 6 months old, we were living in South America, and my mother at the time was by herself because my dad had already moved up here. And I have 3 other siblings, so she was taking care of all 4 of us. And she noticed that I was ill and getting worse, but she thought that I was just kind of experiencing a cold, a bad cold, or maybe flu-like symptoms because I was showing that I was having a hard time breathing.
Mm-hmm.
And so she went to the local clinic slash hospital, met with the doctors, and the doctors felt like this was progressing enough that they wanted to keep me at the hospital for observation just to be sure everything was all right. It didn't take very long while I was there to realize that things were going south pretty fast. My vitals were going south. My organs were shutting down. I just wasn't responding at all. There wasn't much they could do because what was going on was that I had a real bad bronchitis, like a pneumonia type of an arrangement. And so the doctors within a short period of time pulled my mother out of the hospital room. And I'm going to just kind of stop right there for a second because this is where I sort of come into my lucid dream and visions. When I was 15 years old, I started to have these dreams where I was in the hospital with my mother and several other people. And this went on for quite a long period of time in terms of how many of these dreams I was having. But I remember being in the room with her, and she was quite young. And I remember thinking, well, this can't be like real time because she's pretty young here. And I remember all the people that were there. There was my aunt and some other neighbors and one other person. And I remember the doctors coming in. I was sitting literally next to my mom. She was on the bed looking at the baby in an incubator. And I felt drawn to the baby, but I was really mostly drawn to my mom at the time. And when the doctor asked her to come out to talk to her about my situation, I remember feeling this sort of lucidness because I knew I wasn't there, but I could feel that I was there. I felt all of the energies. I felt all of the emotions. I was very aware of the conversation and the situation that was going on. And they were explaining to her that I didn't have much time to live. That it seemed as though things had progressed so much that if I made it a couple hours, that would be probably all I had left. So they asked permission to have the church minister or priest come in to be with the family and to give me my last rites. Now, at that moment, I wasn't quite 100% sure of who I was. I mean, I thought at first I was just really kind of in this real bizarre dream where I could feel all of this happening. But when she went back into the room and I was with her there, I could feel the connection with the baby in the incubator, and it became very clear to me that that baby was me.
Hmm.
And so she, rather than doing what most parents would do, which is to say, be there for the last few hours of my life, she decided to collect her things, and she left the hospital, walked down to a church that wasn't that far away. And when she got to about a block away from the church, she had this thing, this just like I could feel like she just kind of went into this sort of meditative state, and she got on her knees and she crawled to the church, went up the stairs on her knees, went into the altar, went up to the church altar on her knees, and was just literally I really haven't explained it this way, but it's almost like she was in not only in a meditative state, but she was kind of like speaking in like tongues, if you want to, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
She was so immersed in it, and I could feel that immersion, that I remember how she I could sense the energy in the room shifting. And this happened in the hospital as well. When the doctor explained that I was going to live, everything changed in the room. Energy shifted. And when she was in the church meditating, praying at the altar, things shifted again. But here was the interesting thing, was that I expected her to be praying in terms of asking for me to stay alive, to give me another chance. She wasn't doing that. She was really praying from a state of appreciation and gratitude. And her prayer was more along the lines of, thank you so much for the 6 months that you gave me with this child, and the love that you gave me, and the experience that I had with this baby. Thank you. It was a real interesting. I remember sitting there and thinking how strange it was that she was giving thanks instead of asking for help, so to speak.
Sure. Wow.
As she was doing that, the room shifted again, and in terms of frequency, in terms of energy, and I could all of a sudden see in what was going on in her mind. So I could feel her thoughts. These weren't things that she was saying out loud. Everything was telepathic. And I started to see a visual of my life in the future. And I remember that she was staring at this visual and seeing myself as an older man, a son, a husband, a father, a person that was contributing to his life and the world.
Hmm.
And it was as though we were watching a movie together. And she was, again, so grateful for getting an opportunity to envision a world of where I was still there years later as a man, even though she knew that when she went back, she wasn't going to have that outcome. she just felt again such a strong sense of gratitude and appreciation for that opportunity that she told me later that she couldn't even see a world that would exist without me there. Yet she knew that the outcome would likely be that I wasn't going to be there. So when that visual occurred to her, she again, I keep stressing the shift in energy because these were like powerful frequencies that were coming through. I wasn't aware of any of this. I just could feel it. There was a softer tone. There was a loving tone. There was this sense of warmth and comfort and security. And she felt okay. She felt okay with whatever the outcome was going to be. And so she got up. She went back to the hospital. And when she got to the door of the hospital, she was greeted by everybody, including the doctors, and everybody had tears, but they weren't crying because I was dead, but because in the little time that she was gone, everything had changed. My vitals went back. I started breathing better. My organs started to come back. I was basically recovering. And so back then, and even to this day, you know, there's when these events happen, the medical community don't really know how to explain it, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they back then in particular, they just brushed it. They didn't brush it off, but they just chalked it up as a miracle, and that's it. They went on. So I went home the next day, and it was as though nothing had happened. Now, the second part of that was in my visions and dreams was that I saw what had happened during that time that she was in the hospital. I saw how I left myself in that room. And I immediately went into this space that the only way to describe it was that it felt like it was this endless stream of sand, like as if I was in a desert. And I remember looking down and I see this older gentleman, very old gentleman, somewhat decrepit, and he was begging for what I thought was like food or something. But he was just the intensity on his face. I'll never forget it. He was he was literally begging, but not for food, not the kind of food you were thinking or I would think. But he was looking not at me, but through me. And I could tell that there was something behind him that he was so desperately thirsty for and hungry for. So I turned behind me and I saw this amazingly huge orb. It was beautiful. And I remember that it was like about 10 times bigger than our sun, and thinking immediately, why isn't this hurting my eyes? And I turned back, and the older gentleman became this young boy in the same situation. He was like hungry, thirsty for something beyond me. And I turned back, and this light was now like right on me. And when it got that close to me, I felt every cell in my body vibrate like nothing I had ever experienced before. It was like the frequency of this thing was intense, but it was beautiful. And when I finally got immersed in it, I felt it go through every aspect of me. So, like they say, you have 50 trillion cells in your body, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
At that moment, when that energy, that frequency, that love, that it's so hard to describe this thing because there aren't really great adjectives for it. But when this energy flew through me, it was like I felt 50 trillion experiences of blissfulness. But it wasn't as though I was feeling it as just one being. I felt it as though I was 50 trillion beings experiencing myself as myself at that moment, which was really, I remember it was really bizarre because I saw an endless streams of me experiencing this ecstasy. And at that moment, there were a couple of silhouettes that came through this light. And I remember that they didn't have any facial, there was no facial characteristics. There were no body characteristics to them. It was just like, they were just these beautiful, beaming, spiritual beings, lighted beings. And even though I didn't know who they were from a facial characteristic, I knew who they were in my world. I felt them as though they were my family. I felt them as though I had always known them for lifetimes. I mean, not just this life. It wasn't like I was reuniting with family from this life. It was as if I was reuniting with family from endless lifetimes. And I remember that when they came up to me, and so there was about three of them, and then there were two others that came from behind, and they embraced me. And when they embraced me, I literally blew up. I mean, whatever was there in terms of this translucent body, it was just gone. I became totally united, reunited with the whole stream of light. I knew myself to be endless. It was infinite. And I remember looking around, and as they did that, I remember all these other beings started to appear from the light, and they were everywhere, Brian. I mean, it was like you would spend a lifetime counting them, and you would not even come close to how many were there. They were infinite.
Mm.
When that happened, I'm kind of shortening this experience a little bit, but when that happened, I realized something about the existence of who we are that wasn't quite clear to me at that moment, because I did mention that there was also this, from the moment that I moved into the light, there was this energy around me, and it was as though this energy was very, it was very aware of itself, and I was very aware of it, and it kind of moved me along this experience. So it was kind of guiding me through this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
I later realized that energy stream of consciousness was what I later connected to as a child and into my adulthood life, which is this collective I channel, which is called Kayla. And so they were there guiding me through this. And I remember them telling me, or asking me, what do you see? And it wasn't as though I was seeing with my eyes, because when you're there, you don't see anything with your eyes. You have 360 vision, and you feel things. That's how you connect with everything. But I understood what they were saying, and they were really insistent on me experiencing whatever it was that they wanted me to quote unquote see. And that's when I really spent time, though I didn't really care to be honest with you. I didn't care to do anything but be in this state. I didn't want to do anything else. Um, I realized that there was something they wanted me to experience and remember, so that when I came back years later, I could share that with people and with humanity. And so at that moment, when I realized the connection, it was as though they grabbed me, even though, again, nothing had a real physical form, but I could feel this, like a sense of an arm or hand, and they grabbed me, whisked me back through the tunnel that everybody talks about. And in my case, there was a tunnel. It was very bright. It was very brilliant. It had various different lights to it. And then the next thing I knew, I landed in my bed 15 years later, experiencing something that had happened when I was 6 months old at the time. So this kept going on for months and months, and I was really, well, suffice it to say, I was really losing it. I was a teenager. I didn't know where to turn to for this kind of stuff. Um, my life had been already exposed to a lot of supernatural events. I lived in a house that I referred to in my book as the hauntings. So to me, supernatural stuff was pretty common stuff, but this one felt very different. It was so different, and it was so real to me that wherever I was, I didn't want to come back, and I started to cry like a baby. And every time I had this vision or dream, I cried, because it was just that intense. Eventually, I wound up talking to my mother about it, because I had to talk to somebody about it. And when I did, she told me, I remember her face. We were in the kitchen, and when I did, and I explained to her all the events, and more particularly her discussions with the doctor, her prayers, her visions, she even though we had a lot of supernatural stuff in our lives up to that point, she just could not believe how accurate my story was in terms of what happened that day and night when I passed away for a brief time. And she encouraged me to talk to somebody about it. But back then, there were only a couple people you could talk about with this. There weren't Facebook groups or anything. There were therapists and there were priests, you know?
Yeah.
No, I had already seen enough to realize that if I had done that, I would have been labeled in some way, shape, or form as not being well. And so I hid it for many, many years. Hid it, and it almost drove me crazy. And then, as I describe in the story about how I eventually came to terms with it after going through a massive spiritual crisis, and I became aware of who I was spiritually, and I became aware of my clairvoyant abilities. And since then, my world has been different. Let's just say, in a much better way.
Yeah. So that was the awakening you had in 2010, that crisis you're
Oh
talking about?
no, no, the awakening in 20. So you know this from everybody that you have talked to. So there's these things. So that was my near-death experience, transferred or translated as a spiritually transformative experience.
Yeah.
Um, and that's, I tell people a lot that the spiritually transformative experiences come in all shapes and sizes,
Right.
and I um I had a number of different events in my life where I had some brief exposure to the multidimensionality of our reality, to even the aspects of the holographic simulation reality of our world. And none of this made sense to me at the time. But later on in life, I realized that they were events that were there to try to help me wake up.
Mm-hmm.
In 2009 and 10, I had a series. I was hitting the apex of my spiritual crisis,
That's what I was
and
referring to. Yeah. Okay.
they and I literally, I talk about this quite a bit in the book, that I really had hit a point where I was really massively depressed, barely hanging on to whatever you want to call reality, because to me this wasn't reality. And I pleaded really to them to come through, because I knew they were there. They, meaning this whole collectiveness. They've been in my life in various ways for so long, coming in and out. But it was really me that held them back. It was me that did not want them in my life. And so at that moment, I really hit a crisis point where the depression had been so bad, that I I needed them to come through. And
Mm-hmm.
for about 2 to 3 months after that night, I had events which I call downloads, which we call downloads. Um, and in those downloads, I was shown, it was my introduction to my collective, to the collective, but also an introduction to everything. I really had massive downloads. I spent hours, days, weeks just writing things that I did not have any reason to know about, subject matters about quantum physics and mathematics that I had no idea existed, and things about spirituality and the holographic universe and all this. And I just wrote them, but it was clear to me at that point that I could never look back again. And that was about 2010,
Mm-hmm.
and it just came like a rush. Now later on, I came to realize that in the grand scheme of things, there are periods right now in humanity that exist right now that are part of the awakening. And from 2009 to 2012, there was a significant number of people that began their awakening process, either through the forms of really rarely NDEs, or remembering their NDEs, or experiencing NDEs. It was mostly STs, the spiritually transformative experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just had another one in 2019 and 2022. That was stage 2 of the awakening. And these were all premonitions that I was given 10, 12 years ago, in terms of the timeline of humanity, and all sorts of things in terms of why we're here and what is this thing called heaven, and all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in my book that I wrote, and it's also in after I finished my first book, and I remember putting my pen down, if so to speak. I was actually on a computer.
Right.
I thanked them for having given me the information, the wisdom to write this book, because I didn't have any desire to write a book. They told me to write one. Um, and right as I put the period down, and I was literally in tears because it was a very emotional chapter, for me at least, they say, "You're not done." And I said, "What do you mean you're not done?" And they said, "No, you're not done. You have 8 more books to write." And
Oh,
I said,
wow.
"What?" And I said, "I didn't know what I was writing in my first book. And you want me to write 8 more books?" And then they spent the next couple hours with me writing the synopsis for 8 books that I didn't even know existed a couple hours before.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So tell me about you said we had an awakening in, you said 2009.
nine.
10, somewhere
Yeah.
in that range. And then there was one you said 2019 and 2022.
Yes.
So
Yes.
what was that about? Tell me about that.
So the awakening, everything's energy. So I'm going to start there.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's energy. And I know you've heard this before, but because of energy frequencies, there is this sort of delicate balance we have to be mindful of as we're going through an awakening process, or some people call it an ascension process or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And we as humanity are not currently vibing at a high level of frequency that could accept the frequency of awakening the way that we've been told, where you feel heaven on earth and all of these things. We're not there yet to do it immediately. So it's coming in stages. So in 2009 to 2012, the first wave of energy came, which really tilted humanity, really tilted the earth in a direction towards what we call fifth dimensional energies, which again is heaven on earth. Okay.
Okay.
And so only a certain number of people woke up during that time. And those people were sort of laying out the groundwork for the next group of people that would actually do a lot of the speaking, teaching, guiding, healing portions of this whole collective ascension. So in 2009, 2012, the earth starts to shift. And when I say earth, I mean Gaia. Like Gaia has a spirit. Okay. Earth actually has a spirit.
Mm-hmm.
It's a living organism. And in that time period, when that shifted, it started to create this rift between third dimensional energy, which is what we exist in, and this thing called fifth dimensional energy. When that happened, um, you hear about this from like the Mayans and stuff. Okay, there's so many references to that time period where humanity starts to enter into a new age.
Mm-hmm.
Those That time period was to, in a sense, you had things going on the surface, so to speak, like awareness things, like the expansion and awareness, and relatively speaking, the acceptance of like gender equality, not gender equality, sexual equality. Okay, so this is actually a big deal, the sexual piece, because in the world of the metaphysical, what we would call heaven, there is no such thing as gender. So the fact that we've gotten, we created this opportunity to start expanding our awareness as a collective consciousness to things like that started opening up the door for these energies to come in, whereby this new group of people, and from 2019 to 2012, the teachers, the healers, the guides, the guardians, this is what they describe to me, and I write about this in the book about what they do. They are here to really push this collective group of humanity through the awakening, what's called the ascension, because this is all an earth school. And so they're here to kind of, in a sense, they're kind of like we're all collectively working to birth a new world, like midwives, so to speak. The
Mm-hmm.
last phase of the awakening is really a celebration of this new life. The vast majority of humanity is actually beginning. The seeds were planted in this time period, 219 to 222, to give the rest of humanity the seeds, what I would call the DNA genetic resequencing of their codes. Okay, so when we get into like epigenetics and stuff, right,
Mm-hmm.
there's this resequencing of codes to allow the rest of humanity, the part that was here to wake up to themselves in this period. This is what's happening now, and it looks like a lot of chaos to people, and it is on the surface, but underneath the surface there's this new stream of consciousness rising that's pushing that out to the surface. And when that's all done, and it's going to be done pretty soon here, you're going to get this lighter energy and this more of a sense of global awareness that we never had before. And that will go into 2019, 2029, and 2032. At that time, everybody, this is what's crazy, is that when I started talking about this, I really kind of, I sat down with the collective, so to speak, and I said, are you sure you want me to talk about these timelines? Because these are pretty aggressive timelines here, okay? And I'm going to be sticking my neck out to talk about these things. But they were very adamant to share this. And And so in 229 to 232, the rest of humanity finally bursts through its awareness and awakening. And what we have at that point is what a lot of people have referred to as the golden age, heaven on earth. It is a whole different world, and it's not going to take hundreds or thousands of years. In fact, it is that world that will allow us to break the veil and enable us to experience truly what would be heaven on earth from the standpoint that there's no death, there's no disease, there's no aging, there's no hunger, there's none of those things. Plus, we get to experience ourselves more as light so that we can communicate with those that have passed on to that dimension we call heaven. Heaven literally does come down to earth and collapses onto this dimension.
I'm excited to announce I have a great new resource. It's called GEMS, 4 Steps to Move from Grief to Joy. And what it is, it's 4 things that I've found that I do on a daily basis to help me to navigate my grief. And I'm offering it to you free of charge. It's a free download. Just go to my website, www.grieftogrowth.com/gems, GEMS, and grab it there for free. I hope you enjoy it.
It's all one and the same. We don't have to die to be reunited with loved ones or to experience the blissfulness that I felt and others have felt when they had their NDEs. That's what was meant by heaven on earth, a state of consciousness. That's what we would call in the spiritual realms a higher dimension of consciousness.
Yeah. So this collective Caleb that communicates with you, have they indicated to you who they are?
Oh yeah. So this gets back to what I saw at the end of that experience of my near death. And I told you that they wanted me to experience something. And when I did, it was at that moment that they whisked me back. So many years later, I was feeling a sense of not disconnection, but like I was missing some of the pieces of the puzzle. I knew there was something more, and I wanted to go back to that experience to remember it better. And it was in that process that they shared with me something that was pretty monumental. And it's not something, again, one of those things that I really had to spend some time with my own self, my own collectiveness of myself, as if I was really ready to share that. But this is what they wanted humanity to remember. Really, it's just to remember. When I told you that I had seen this endless stream of individual beings that really lit up this enormous orb, what dawned on me at that time, and it didn't happen right away. It came through a couple of visions and whatnot. But what happened eventually was that I realized that what they wanted me to see, and because I already referred to them as the collective, but it was later that I asked them permission to give me a name so I could give them more of a slightly more human quality to it. And they said Caleb. They refer to themselves as the collective, and they do this really with anybody, whether it's Abraham Hicks or Bashar or any of the channelers out there. And there's 2 pieces to this. The simple way of describing this is that the collective is every stream of consciousness, including us. We're all part of the collective. But as far as how we communicate with them in this form, it's no different than, say, for instance, and then this is going to date me a little bit, but you remember the visions of being of these big old rooms where there were operators and they had their headsets and okay. Yeah. So they basically said, imagine yourself in this massive room with a stream of operators basically going, hello, connecting you to the next person or whatever. In one end of that room would be the collective stream that I was tapping into. And in another end of that room could be the collective stream that any other person was tapping into in terms of a channeling state. And it went on throughout everywhere. But it was all the same collective. Okay. It wasn't like my collective is different from this collective or that collective. It's all the same collective. It's just where you were tapping into. But all of that collectiveness was God. Okay. And the way that they explain that portion of it is the part that I'm going to tell you, the part 2 of this. The part 2 of this is that when I came back, and saw what I saw and remembered what I saw, is that they were trying to show me that even though, and this day and age is a little bit easier to embrace this, because back not even more than 10, 15, 20 years ago, it wasn't commonly discussed this way. But I feel that most people have a sense that there is this sort of light of godliness in them, like a spark of light in them, a divinity of some sort. And the whole idea, especially with the spiritualism and New Age discussion, is that, the idea is to try to tap into that light again.
Mm-hmm.
Even though that is somewhat true, what what they wanted me to share with humanity was that even though that is true to a certain extent, the question is more what came first. And we've been told by the way that we grew up, in whatever faith that we have, that we were always somewhat disconnected from this thing called God, source, creator, spirit, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the world that I came from. Not only that was I disconnected from it, I also had to carry the burden of this thing called original sin, which I didn't have a clue as to what that was, but apparently I acquired it. Okay.
Right.
I have a lot of other students who are from the Buddhist and Hindu faith, and they acquired something similar, which was karma.
Yeah.
And don't know how, don't know why. It was there, you got to deal with it, and you spend the rest of your life having to cope with it.
Right.
So we're dealing with all this disconnection, and all of a sudden they throw this, I would call it a major curve, all right, curveball. And that is that it isn't that God formed itself into something, okay, conscious awareness of itself, okay. It wasn't that it formed itself and then ultimately wanted to express itself through individual streams of itself. We would know ourselves, that spark of divinity in us. It was actually that we, as supreme beings, individually came together collectively to form God. We are that superior, that we collectively realize ourselves to be, realize that in our gathering of ourselves as a collection, and this is very common in nature and every form. You look at the way the universes are formed and nature operates, it's all about collectiveness. When you come together, it's when you realize who you can be. The ultimateness of oneness is to see yourself as everything and yet nothing. And that's the collection. That's why they call themselves the collective. And that applies to me or anybody else who channels it. Ultimately, they call themselves the collective. And if that wasn't clear enough to me at the time, I asked for clarification, because again, I'm just the messenger in many ways,
Yeah.
and so I want to make sure that I'm interpreting this stuff clearly. So in one of not too long ago, several years ago, I had a vision. It was more like a lucid dream. And I was asking for clarification on what I was feeling in terms of this explanation of us being the supreme beings that actually created God. And they gave me a verse, a biblical verse.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm not a biblical person, even though I was born and raised as a Catholic. I'm just not. And I'm not with any sacred book. I appreciate them. They respect them. There's a lot of great clues in there. But the verse was chapter 1, verse 26 in Genesis. And I went into the Bible and I looked it up. And to my amazement, in that verse, it talks about when man was created by God.
Mm-hmm.
Back then it was man, right? Now it's humanity. And what I was shocked about was that in the description, I was shocked at the fact that it was expressed in the way that it went like something like this: God created man in let's create man in our image, like us. There were pluralities everywhere. It was clear to me at that point that what I had seen and what I was supposed to say was to express that verse in some way, in that it was meant to show humanity that we weren't created by a singular thing called God. We were created by this enormity of the collection of individuality, because there wouldn't have been plurality all over that sentence. It's the only sentence that actually references it that way.
Yeah.
And I'm shocked that it was left there. I was
Yeah.
really was. I
Yeah.
was like, I know how much those books have been edited, and I was really shocked that that
Yeah.
was left there. But later on, I became fully aware that life in and of itself has tremendous clues and riddles plastered everywhere
Sure.
that help us realize who we really are everywhere. And this was just one of those.
What's funny was when you started talking about that, my mind went to a verse where Jesus talks about, and he references Psalms, which is in the Old Testament also, where the psalmist talks about us as being gods, and
Yes.
Jesus refers to us as gods, and people gloss right over that.
They gloss right over it.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, that's, he was just trying to, he always liked to talk in parables and stuff. And, oh, that must have just been one of those kind of glossy parable like kind of things or metaphoric kind of things. But it wasn't. There were clear clues to the reality of who we are. And again, if it wasn't enough that Yeshua said it a couple, in there, and it was very clear,
Mm-hmm.
right at the beginning of the sacred of all of this sacred book,
Right.
right at the beginning,
Yeah. Yeah.
it
Let
says
us
it.
make man in our image. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we just went, it's all right. Let's move on.
Yeah.
But I couldn't move on because that was a message that I was supposed to bring back. And when I talk to NDEers, a lot of the ones that I've talked to, when I start talking about this, many of them will go, OMG, I remember this.
Mm-hmm.
There was something I wanted to articulate, but I couldn't articulate it. And you just did it for me.
Yeah.
But that's almost inevitably the way that they experience this when I started explaining what I had been told. They're like, I remember being shown this. They just didn't bring it back with them because there were certain things they had forgotten.
So, Franco, what do you think is the reason why we don't remember this? Why are we in the state that we're in where we feel so disconnected and we feel so powerless?
Oh, good question. So this gets to the second thing that we sort of have to embrace, which gets, if the first part of it, you are God, okay, isn't enough to kind of make your head spin. The second part of it is that you are experiencing this experience in the way that people have kind of said that you're experiencing it to appreciate yourself as God, so that in appreciation, when you come back to who you really are, you will have a different perspective of yourself as God. But there's more to that, way more to that.
Hmm.
Okay. The other part of it is that, not only is there appreciation, but you also create expansion and growth as a collective of God. Okay. That's good too. All right.
Hmm.
People kind of talked about all that. The third part of it, and probably not the most important, but most critical to this point in time with human history, is that we're here to realize that we've been experiencing all that in this thing that the best way to describe it would be a holographic simulation or reality.
Hmm.
And that's hard for people to grasp, because then they start running off into tangents about a Maya program and all that. And there's much more to that than that. But the holographic simulation is a game. And I've had people kind of criticize me for saying that it's a game, but hey, look, I'm just the messenger. This is what they told me. Okay. But it is a game.
Hmm.
I mean, if I had to express it for myself, I would say it is a game because it's a simulation. And if you know about the way the kids these days, and everybody really are into highly advanced virtual reality games, well, that's peanuts compared to this one.
Hmm.
This is all a virtual reality game. And the crazy thing is that it's a virtual reality game that we are experiencing individually as God. So in essence, we're creating the virtual reality game, each and every one of us
Hmm.
individually. Kind of like when you play, and I don't do this, but I have kids and they play simulated games and they're playing on their own. And then I'm getting bored with playing with just myself. So I'm going to go and connect with everybody worldwide and have a game going on
Right.
like that. It's
Right.
very
Right.
similar. But the purpose of that is so that we can experience ourselves in such an extreme form of contrast, so that that form of contrast ultimately wakes us up to realize that there has to be more to this than this extreme world of contrast. And that's the waking up portion to help us to simulate our way through this illusion And the way that the Earth School works is that the practicum that you have to do. So, just like any school, you go through these classes. And then when you're done, you have to do a practicum or final exam. And the final exam is to see, can you get through all this? Can you wake yourself up through all this? Because if you do, you experience a level of consciousness that has never, that no thing has ever experienced, ever, in this thing that we call divinity. We're literally creating a whole new consciousness whereby we have taken contrast to the extreme and can now take it with us in higher levels of consciousness without associating it with fear. Fear becomes our friend, and we use it to help us remember so that we can grow. It's not there to punish us in the way that we punish ourselves with it here. And that's it. That's the graduation piece. Doing that is a heck of a process, though, because we have to go through all of these blockages that we have. And so when we have experiences, I feel like they're telling me to say this. So when we have experiences of loss, that loss was a spiritually transformative experience to help us see ourselves as much more than who we are. It doesn't seem that way at first, because so we're wrapped up in the loss. But in the contractual sense of things, that was meant to happen as an act of unconditional love by the individual who did it, so that they could help that person wake up to who they really are. Otherwise, it like I said, spiritually transformative experiences are intense. They can be intense, and that's one form of it.
Right.
It's always done because always, I'm always asked this question: why all the violence? Why all the pain? Why all the death? Why? And I tell them there's a little bit more of an explanation to this, but ultimately it's done out of unconditional love. These souls come here as a contractual arrangement to help the soul that's trying to elevate its consciousness. By doing what they do, by doing that, they feel, and it's pretty intense, like a near-death experience, if not worse, it helps that individual ask the hard questions about who they are.
It's interesting because we've been trying to figure this out as humankind for a long time. And I got so many ways I can go with this, because when you were talking about us getting back to, or getting to that state where it's kind of more like heaven, if you read Swedenborg, he kind of says that we were there at one point.
We are actually there.
Yeah.
Brian, we're there.
Okay.
We have to just remember that we're
there. Yeah. Well, yeah. But we're still living this, and it's apparent separation. So Swedenborg says there was a time like when people died, we could commune with their spirits. And now we feel like where'd they go?
Yeah.
So I feel like we're kind of coming back around.
Absolutely.
But I think, and we've always tried to use analogies, and I love studying this stuff too. And so, like, over the years, we use different analogies for heaven and earth and different things. I think now that we're at the point where technology is where it is, the video game analogy is the best one I've come up with. The holographic. It's just an analogy, but it's a good analogy, because my daughter and I love to play video games. And when you get into a video game and you're really into it, especially now, because this was before there was VR, but now there's this virtual reality with the goggles and stuff.
Yeah.
And you really think you're there. And like
absolutely,
you said, this is the ultimate of that. This is where it's full on five senses, 24/7.
This is it. I mean, this is, I'm it's cool that you get that, because that to me was the thing that in the early downloads that I got was the same conclusion. I mean, it took me a while to kind of piece it together, because back then, this is 2009, reality games weren't where they were, but
Right.
but they are where they are now.
Right.
But they kept telling me that there would become a time where, and it's even in part of my book. It's a really small piece of the book where I talk about how we get to a point where this simulated life, starts to mirror the actual life that we know ourselves to be a spirit. Mm-hmm. And when you get to that point, you've gotten to a point where you no longer need this simulation. This whole simulation is done, because now we're starting to repeat ourselves. Mm. And we've hit the apex of that. And we can go further with artificial intelligence, and there's a whole story behind that too, in terms of how that plays out in two Earth timelines. But we've achieved enough now to know that the game is over. We've done it. We're actually so good at it now that we're creating virtual reality games within virtual reality games within virtual reality
Yeah.
games.
Yeah.
So now the question is, can you, knowing all of this, wake up to the greatest virtual reality game that you've ever experienced? One that you were personally involved in designing, because that's when you raise your consciousness to a whole new level, to an
Hmm.
entire whole new level. And that's what they refer to as God consciousness, Christ consciousness, Buddha, Krishna, divine feminine, you name it. That's all what we're talking about here.
Right. Right. So this age that we're coming into, you mentioned no death and no sickness. From
Yes.
a physical perspective, as an engineer,
Yeah.
what changes? Because these bodies we have now, they die, they get sick.
Yes. Well, again, a little bit of a reference in the book, but what basically happens is that, um, actually, there's more than that, a small reference, but the body is made up of DNA sequencing, right?
Hmm.
The genetic DNA. And I don't remember the percentage, but it's a pretty high percentage of the DNA structure is dormant.
Hmm.
Um, and sadly, this is the way we have operated for decades. We view that dormant DNA. Now, if you're talking about people in the world of epigenetics, which is an advanced form of science that's now looking at all this more carefully, and neuroplasticity and all that,
Right.
if you take that aside, you just look at what everybody else basically believes, that 95% or so of our DNA is dormant, and they call it garbage DNA.
Hmm.
That 95%, in addition to the fact that not all of the sequencing patterns of our DNA that is active has been utilized to its fullest potential. In other words, there are unlimited number of combinations you could use with just that 5%. We haven't even come close to that. When we get to a higher level of frequency and consciousness, that frequency will trigger a resequencing of some of that active DNA, and it will also activate the other 95% of the inactive DNA, which we call garbage.
Mm.
That inactive DNA was only inactive because it was meant to be triggered once we got to fifth, sixth levels of consciousness. When you get to that, your body becomes an intelligence unlike anything that you could possibly imagine. You could travel to other parts of the universe. You could go multidimensional with this thing.
Hmm.
It becomes a true vessel the way that it was designed to be. And that's what changes.
Wow. Wow. So since we were going down this rabbit hole, because
Yeah.
I asked you for some questions before we got started, and I don't typically just read the questions, but you had one that I really want to talk about, and I'll tell people you already know this. This is a pretty advanced episode here, but we're talking about some stuff that really fascinates me. But
Yeah.
you mentioned parallel realities versus multiverses versus multidimensions.
Yeah.
So expand on that. Tell me what you mean by that.
Yes. You're one of the first to ever ask me about this. So this is
I
kind of
will
fresh
start by
stuff.
saying I've been reading Tom Campbell, and that led Christian Sundberg, which led me to Tom Campbell, which led me to the Seth books. So I'm reading the Seth books now. So everything you're saying is just like fitting right. I'm fitting puzzle pieces together.
That's cool. I know of Seth a little bit, but I didn't know about any of those others. So it's really fun to see how those pieces come together as a big puzzle.
Yeah.
Um, so the best way to describe the three, because they're often, if they're used, okay, if they're used by anybody, it oftentimes they're kind of interchangeable. Okay.
Right.
So what is referred to as a parallel reality, the way that they showed it to me, is that as we live in every moment of our existence, okay, since this is all simulation, and they actually did a really nice job of showing it to me in the kind of in a metaphorical way in the book, but we exist in the now. There is no past and there is no future. I know that that seems hard to believe, but there is no past, no future. It's now. Everything is now. And when you exist in the now, every moment that you exist is a new reality. Okay. It literally is like when you have that comic book strip thing where you kind of roll, flip through the pages at a rapid speed, and the character starts to take emotional reality. I
Hmm.
don't know what that's called. I forget what it's called, but I think most people understand that. Okay. Individually, those strips don't really have a lot of motion to them. If they don't have any motion to them, there's no sense of time or space. But when you flip them like 100 at a time real rapidly, they start to take on emotional perspective, emotion-like perspective.
Right.
That is what parallel realities are. In other words, when you have a thought and it gets translated into a feeling, and you express it out into this universe, which is also an aspect of you as consciousness, everything's connected to you. You're like, everything's hardwired to you, okay? But in this sense, you have a thought, it turns into it mixed with an emotion, has a feeling. When that energy goes out into the universe, you literally have an endless stream of film strips, endless streams of film strips that are hovering around you. And it literally connects to one of those film strips. It brings it down as part of that strip of film, but it does it in terms of, like, we would think of a film strip, and you would think of one film strip, one film strip, one film strip. Inside that film strip, there is literally billions of other film strips coming together, so that it gives you the sense that everything is moving in emotional direction. The time is being measured that way. Okay, I hope this makes sense. But in that process, you are pulling from parallel realities, endless streams of possibilities.
Yeah.
Which is why it's hard for psychics, for instance, to give you a clear picture of what might happen in the future. They will give you a picture of what possibly could happen based on the frequency of that, of where you're at that moment. And they can see a potential possibility through the parallel realities that you exist in. But you have an event in that life. You walk out that door, and all of a sudden you have an event that's spiritually transformative. It changes the parallel reality schemes all over the place. So they always treat it as like individual film strips. You lay them on the track, and it literally, they showed me, it's like a track, like a railroad track. Every time you have just the slightest deviation in thought, and I mean slight. I'll give you an example. If you say something and you say, I think this is going to happen, versus I feel this is going to happen, you just pulled from a different parallel reality. It doesn't feel any different, but you just did. Why? Because feeling is fifth dimensional. It's a frequency that will pull different strip out. So that's parallel realities. Okay. That's the simplest way I can describe it.
Right.
The multiverse is oftentimes associated with the creation of a new stream of consciousness that comes through the experience that we are having as spiritual beings. So, for instance, we are now at a point where we have expanded our consciousness so high that what we are creating, as I told you, is a new form of consciousness. In that form of consciousness, the way energy works is that it circulates in such a way that it, at the point of the highest peak that it's at, it implodes into matter. We're at that point that we're peaking, not right now, but in the next 10 years, we're going to peak so high that we're going to explode into another form of matter consciously, and we create a whole new universe. Literally create a whole new universe, which is very consistent with the way the universe theoretically was created in this world. Okay. But it's done by conscious streams. Okay. And so that's the multiverse. We are literally creating universes as we expand into different directions of consciousness because of the way energy tightens and it implodes. Okay. There are endless numbers of multiverses based on all these schools that we have been through already. The Earth is not the only Earth school. And so many multiverses. Some of those multiverses can be multidimensional, meaning that the stream of consciousness is vibrating at a very high level. That's why you hear about fifth dimension, sixth dimension, seventh. There are a lot of dimensions. Okay. And this gets into all sorts of other things, but I'll keep it just defined to the higher self. The higher self has 12 dimensions. And in those dimensions, it's a higher state of awareness of who you are as God. It is like ultimate blissfulness when you get to the 8th, 9th, 10th, 12th dimensions. But there are even more beyond those. Okay. But in that scheme of things, you create dimensional states of consciousness. In other words, you now start to no longer experience yourself as a body. You experience yourself as a light. And then when you experience yourself as a light, you experience yourself as everything and nothing. It's that blissful and that intense. Those are the dimensions. And that's what we're streaming up towards. We're streaming up towards living in a third dimension to a fourth dimensional awareness. It's not, a lot of people say fourth dimension is time. No, That does not exist. Time is not the fourth dimension. It's awareness. Fifth dimension is when you know and can become yourself as an intelligence known as Christ consciousness, God consciousness, all that. Your energy is so vibrating so purely at that point that all you can feel and know yourself to be is unconditional love. And by the time you get to sixth dimension, which is where you really have the reunion of heaven on earth, that's in 2032, 2033. That's where you no longer feel that you even need your body anymore. You can use it, but you don't need it anymore. You become light. You go back to being light again.
Yeah, I could go on, but I want to. There are a few more questions I want to get to, so
Yeah,
I'm
I hope that
sorry to
that
interrupt you.
helps to see that there
It
are
does.
differences in all
Does.
three
And
of them.
I want to say to people that are probably minds are blown, you have to keep going at this. You have to. And I mentioned Tom Campbell. I know you said you're not aware of Tom Campbell, but he describes it almost exactly what you did. These, but he calls it like branches.
Yeah.
And Christian Sundberg, who has pre-birth memories, talks about like life is like a tree laid on its side, and every time you make a decision, it branches off. But what Tom Campbell
Yes.
says is all those branches actually exist. All those other potentials actually exist.
They do exist. They exist in a way that they're there and you are living literally a limitless number of realities, but your main focus of consciousness is in this one.
Yeah.
So that the other ones can exist, do exist, but they're not, let's sort of say, activated fully until you pull them into this stream of consciousness.
Right, right. I do want to talk about because a lot of people listen to this program. We've lost loved ones, and we want to know where are they? Are they okay? Are we going to see them again? All those questions.
Yeah. Well, the easiest way to describe this is that the whole, again, what we like to believe is called heaven is a stream of consciousness in a higher dimension. Okay. And the whole purpose for why we're doing all of this now, why there's this tremendous awareness now, and it's only going to grow exponentially of what we are and can be in this realm, is to merge those two worlds together. And so the simple way of answering that question is that we didn't. Now there are people that will continue to leave here in the process through contracts that they have, and when I mean contracts, they're just called they're just lesson plans. Okay, but when they leave, we're the ones who are here to experience the awakening are here to experience it so that we don't have to physically die to be with quote unquote our loved ones anymore. In fact, in the next several years, as our awareness rises, so do our clairvoyant abilities. And so even though I have these, okay, and yes, you could say I had them because all of a sudden, I had a near-death experience and all that. Yeah, I understand that. But I am here to tell you that every one of us has these abilities. I work with students who never thought in their wildest dreams that they could do what they're doing now. And in a short period of time, they're reattaching themselves to who they are as God, and then using their clairvoyant abilities to connect with other worlds, to connect with families. They're in an awesome place. Okay. They're in a place that it's hard for us to fathom this, but they're in a place that, getting back to something we were talking about, we've been there. In fact, we're there. A big aspect of us as spirit is there already with them.
Right.
And that's hard for people to kind of go, what? I tell people, and I've had people who have lost husbands and children and whatnot. And I say, I know this can be hard for you to understand, but when they crossed over, one of the first people that they call them people beings that they experienced was you. You were already there, welcoming them back. Because again, you have to understand, at least from a simple standpoint, time and space does not exist. This is just an illusion. Everything happens in real time. You're going through something that has really been created in a consciousness stream of mind. You are literally experiencing a simulated game where your loved ones are in it and also part of the game outside of it. Yeah. They're there. Yeah. They're already there. And that's hard for people to believe. But once this whole thing collapses, they're going to experience it real time.
Yeah. The last thing I want to ask you, because before we started talking, and I didn't realize you're doing this working with people. You mentioned students, so tell
Yes.
people about the work that you're doing now.
So one of the things that I realized over time, and I haven't up until very recently told people, is that my experience beyond just what I mentioned is that I'm a walk-in. And walk-ins, for people who don't know, and some people have different definitions of them, but I will tell you that what I came here to do was to help people remember who they were at a relatively high level. In other words, I'm here to help people who are waking up to remember that they came here to be the teachers, the healers, the guardians, the guides, the ones who will shed their light onto the earth and onto the world. And so I've gotten requests from people from all over the world who are experiencing almost identically all of these same experiences, regardless of who they are, their socioeconomic status, doesn't matter. And I know that when they come to me, if they always say the same thing. They always say, I've heard you, I read your book, and it was as though you were speaking to me. And
Mhm.
my job is to speak to them vibrationally in things like this, shows like this, and say, if you're hearing this, you feel it, it's likely you're getting a calling. Let's hook up. You become my student. We work for 4 to 6 months, sometimes less, but very rarely more than 6 months. They remember who they are. They start to see the world in terms of the reality, the simulation, and they start to become masters the way the masters did it, the ones who walked this earth did it. And they actually start to develop supernatural abilities, like clairvoyant abilities. And then they go off and they do their thing to try to shed the light for people, to help people as they're supposed to, as teachers, healers, or guardians.
Yeah.
So as a walk-in, that's my function. So I have students that stick with me for about 4 to 6 months because they feel the calling to do so.
Okay. And remind people of the name of your book and let people know where they can reach out to you.
The book is The Closet Spiritualist, and I always have to stress the because somebody beat me to closet spiritualist. Not that I didn't want that, but I just you could get lost in a different website. But the book is The Closet Spiritualist, and the website is The Closet Spiritualist, and I'm also on Facebook and other things. But the best way to reach me is on my website, and you can get information about the course work that I do, and also how to get my book, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, it's been a real pleasure having you here today. I appreciate you going down the rabbit hole with me.
I love going down the rabbit hole. I'm telling you, you could have we could have gone further.
Yeah.
So
Oh, absolutely. There's so much to talk about. Thanks for being here again
thank you.
and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Brian. Take care.